Hi, I'm Paul Edwards, author of the Mourner's Woods books, and first and foremost, a monster kid. Today, I'm talking about why the Wolfman lost when he fought Godzilla in 1983. Yes, this is a joke, but not in the way you think. There really was a film called Wolfman vs. Godzilla in 1983. It wasn't an official Toho film, but it did exist, and I'll tell you about it in just a moment. No, the joke part here is this format. My friend Jessica Lewis competed on Survivor Season 33, Millennials versus Generation X. And sadly, she did not win. But as a result of that, she now co-hosts a podcast on Rob Has a Website called Why Blank Lost. This is their shirt. And each week, she and her co-host talk about why that week's reality TV contestants lost and got voted out. So a while ago, I thought it would be funny if I did a Why Monster Lost podcast on my own channel, because, monster fans are always having these discussions. Why did this monster beat that one? And although Jessica sometimes watches my channel, she didn't notice. So I did another one and she didn't notice. So now it's a running gag, and I'm going to see how many of these I can get away with putting out before she finally texts me one day and says, "Paul, that's not funny. Stop it." No, Wolfman vs. Godzilla really was a short film that was released in 1983. And it's probably one of the better fan films that's ever been made, because it was made by a bunch of people who worked on the real Toho Studios giant monster films. Shizu Nagajima is the filmmaker who was most directly responsible for this film. And what we have is a bunch of test footage that was shot that has been assembled into a rough story outline, very rough. And it depicts a werewolf who is exposed to radiation and grows to 40 times the size and gets into a fight in werewolf form against Godzilla. The film begins in a very unpromising way. The film begins with a flash forward to a scene that comes later in the movie, and it's never a good sign when you begin your movie with a scene from later in the film, because what you're starting with is not that exciting. So the film opens with a shot of Godzilla fighting against this Wolfman. And the Wolfman you would probably never recognize as a werewolf if you were not told the title of the film. The creature is completely white and has a hulking physique to it. And really, it looks more than anything like an abominable snowman. If somebody told you this film was supposed to be Godzilla versus the abominable snowman, you would believe it. The Godzilla that they show us in this film looks an awful lot like the Godzilla suit that was used in the third Godzilla film, King Kong vs. Godzilla. But it's actually not that same suit. That film had been more than 20 years before they created this. This is a reconstruction of the King Kong vs. Godzilla suit. And hold on, because that's going to change in the course of this short movie. They're going to change Godzillas on us. What happens then is that they begin the story proper. Godzilla is on a rampage, sort of like he was in the early Showa films, where he's rampaging through the countryside, trampling the villages that he crosses through and being hassled by the military. Then the story cuts to the human actors, one of whom is transforming into a werewolf. And they use very Stan Winston-like special effects, practical effects, to show a prolonged sequence where this man is slowly developing the physiognomy of a wolf and bursting out of his clothes like the Incredible Hulk, and going on a rampage as the Wolfman. They cross-cut then to where the army is fighting against Godzilla, while the police force is fighting against the Wolfman, because the Wolfman is still only the size of a human being. We then get a scene where folklore about an ancient wolf object is looked at by some of the characters, but we have no idea what's happening because this film was never dubbed or subtitled into English. It's all in Japanese. So unless you happen to speak Japanese, you're on your own figuring out what's going on here. They look in a book. Next thing you know, the werewolf is gigantic. It's about 150 feet tall. And what happens is some hikers out in the wilderness run across the Wolfman in a scene suspiciously like the hikers running across the brown gargantua in War of the Gargantuas. Now the gigantic Wolfman is on the rampage, and the army has to fight against this one. And they bring out the Mazers. If you're a big fan of the Showa Godzilla films, you probably know that the Maser cannons are energy weapons that the army had in a lot of the older Godzilla movies. And it's sort of a running reference that they include Maser cannons in this film. The army does its best to repel the Wolfman, but of course, it's all for nothing because there has to be a big showdown. And finally, Godzilla crosses paths with the Wolfman. But unlike a few moments ago when the Godzilla costume looked like the costume from King Kong versus Godzilla, now the Godzilla costume that is used is a reconstruction of the Mothra versus Godzilla costume from the fourth Godzilla film, which has a pronouncedly different facial structure. And it's sort of like watching the film Godzilla's Revenge, where they show clips from different Godzilla movies strung together, and it looks like Godzilla changes his face from one scene to the next because the costumes are different. That's what you're getting here. All of a sudden, the Godzilla costume is the Mothra versus Godzilla costume. And Godzilla and the Wolfman get into a knockdown, drag-out fight. The Wolfman in this really behaves pretty much the way that you would expect just a human being to behave. He's standing on two legs and fighting with his arms and, snarling like a wolf at Godzilla, but he's not fighting the way that a wolf actually would, getting down on all fours and pouncing. Godzilla gets a few licks in. The Wolfman gets a couple of shots in as well, and at one point has knocked Godzilla down and is dragging him through the forest by his tail, and it looks like things are going really bad for Godzilla. But then, of course, as you could probably predict, Godzilla uses his atomic fire breath, and the Wolfman has no defense against the atomic fire breath and is easily overpowered by it. He falls down, bonks his head on a boulder, and then Godzilla manages to finish him off with another couple of blasts of his heat breath. And then we're done, because this is only test footage that was shot. So there's no end credits, there's no epilogue scene. That's just the end of the film. The whole film is about 20 minutes long. You can find it easily enough online. A lot of people haven't seen it only because they've never heard of it. Once you know that it exists and is out there, it's easy enough to find online. I only learned of the existence of Wolfman versus Godzilla maybe 5 years ago at the most. And considering how into Godzilla I am, it's kind of surprising to me that I had never heard of it beforehand. This is not a finished product. Don't expect a finished product here. There's no incidental music score. The editing is all slipshod. It's just test footage. And the audio is not great either. But the look of the film is about as good as Toho did in the Showa era. So in that sense, it's absolutely worth checking out, especially if you're a diehard Godzilla fan. So why the Wolfman lost? In answer to our question, the Wolfman lost because he had no defense against Godzilla's heat breath. It's as simple as that. What do you want from a 20-minute monster movie? There's not a more complicated answer. Listen, if you enjoy classic monsters and vintage horror, You would love my book series, the Mourner's Woods books. I'm self-published on Amazon. I've written a series of novels that all take place in a haunted forest, Mourner's Woods. Each book brings a completely new cast of characters into this forbidden wilderness where they face against monsters, ghosts, banshees, all kinds of supernatural threats. But invariably, the most dangerous threat that any character faces in Mourner's Woods is the friend who hiked here with them. My name again is Paul Edwards. My books are the Mourner's Woods books. I post the link to their page on Amazon in the description for this video. Thanks for letting me talk to you some about the Wolfman versus Godzilla. I'll see you in Mourner's Woods.